Haas, National Research University High School of Economics, Moscow. Ja, was wollte ich noch sagen?
Das war's. So, auf Deutsch.
Deutsch.
Ja, genau. Sonst hatte ich das natürlich auf Deutsch auch gemacht.
No, that's okay.
Yeah. I wrote this in English, so I'm going to give it in English. Obviously, the title is somewhat provocative, I guess, I don't know. But it's obviously inspired, if you will, by Heidegger's book, Heidegger's Kant book, Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. So the problem is a problem for Heidegger in that book, and I decided to take up this problem as well. I've been concerned with the problem for a long time. My first book was called Hegel and the Problem of Multiplicity, so it's 15 years ago. It's hard to believe, but it's still. Okay, so what is a problem? The question is threefold. It asks, one, about the what of a problem, not just a philosophical problem, but any problem whatsoever. Two, about the problem, about what is problematic about the problem. Three, about the is of a problem, that is its being, the being of the problem, and what is implied thereby. So, second question first, the problematic of the problem. There are two kinds of problems, conceptual problems, the easy or easier ones, which are not really problematic, but are non-problematic problems, and metaphysical problems, the tough ones, at least insofar as they cause problems, remain problematic. Conceptual problems are a question of knowledge, of the understanding of objects. Metaphysical problems are a matter for thought, for reason. For there are things we can know, cannot know, and yet must be able to think. That is the problem. So then, how can we think a problem without knowing it? Obviously, this is a quote from Kant. Without rendering it a non-problem, without translating it into the language and logic of that which is no problem at all. In other words, what is actually problematic about the problem, about any problem whatsoever, and how can it be thought? On the one hand, the conceptually or categorically problematic is neither esoteric nor apodictic. This is in the critique of pure reason, which is perhaps the most boring part of the critique. I don't know what you think. The table of judgments, the logical function of the understanding and judgments, and the clue to the discovery of all pure concepts of the understanding. Judgments are a question of quantity, quality, relation, or modality. When it comes to modal judgment, I quote from Kant, we first judge something problematically, then take its truth esoterically, and finally claim it as inseparably united with understanding, that is, as necessary and apodictic. Indeed, the problem is that out of which the assertion comes, and that which ends in the apodiction. And the differences in these three modes of judgment, antecedents et consequens, are categorically clear. In apodictic judgments, affirmation or negation is viewed as necessary, notwendig, or unnecessary, zufällig, contingent. If the judgment is not a priori determined, bestimmt by the laws of the understanding. That's why it would be zufällig. In esoteric judgments, affirmation or negation is real, true, an assertion of what is wirklich, of existence, of actually being there, of that which is the case, the presence of what is present or unreal, untrue, the other way, unreal, untrue, false, fiction, like a waxworks if the judgment asserts that which is not the case, not really being there, or true being not actually the case, so unwirklich, not present, but absent, not bound to, verbunden, to the laws of the understanding. In problematic judgments, then, the third kind, affirmation or negation is taken to be possible, möglich, or its other. Heterotes, impossible, unmöglich. The negation or privation, steresis, of possibility, at least insofar as the judgment is admitted, aufgenommen by the understanding. Problematic knowledge, then, is not a problem. It's simply a question of knowing, in accordance with the law of non-contradiction, whether a judgment is possible or not. For example, while we must predict analytically from all bodies are extended to this body is extended, or synthetically from the 12 necessarily follows from 7 plus 5, these are Kant's examples obviously, or while we can assert that the earth actually revolves around the sun, we may only claim to know that vollkommene Gerechtigkeit, perfect justice, complete justice, is a possibility. For it cannot be determined as necessary a priori, nor shown to be actually present in the world, as Hegel might claim, and does claim. Indeed, although nothing speaks for the impossibility of a perfectly just world, we must admit that it may turn out to be imperfect or unjust. And if justice is not just ideal, but has its essence in the real world, and has not yet been actualized insofar as history remains open, perhaps infinite, then we should probably not be surprised that the existence of perfect justice continues to be problematic, a possibly perfect justice. So, a perfection that is neither necessary nor present. On the other hand, there's another kind of problem, the metaphysically problematic. For knowledge of the conceptually problematic cannot be stretched to cover the entire sphere, the beat of the problem. So we must necessarily think that which exceeds all understanding, empirical or transcendental, that which we can have no intuition or representation or concept of, that which is not categorically intelligible. And we must find a language to speak about that which therefore goes beyond all conceptual discourse, but without simply translating or twisting the problematic problem into the unproblematic. For such a sophistical subterfuge, however normal nowadays, merely seeks to avoid the difficult question, to escape the tough problem by changing its meaning to suit our own abilities. Kant says this. Rather, if the conceptually problematic is determined in knowing and speaking by the categories of the possible and the impossible, then we must seek to think a third, what Kant calls das Dritte. So Kant insists, the metaphysical problematic is that before which, I quote from Kant, we can neither say that it's possible nor that it's impossible. So it would be misleading, at least, if not a mistake, to employ the categories of the possible and the impossible when speaking about the problematic. Indeed, possibility and impossibility are categories that do not apply to the thinking and speaking, or should not at least, of problems qua problematic. We may think, for example, the idea of soul, world, God, as thought entities or thought things, Gedankendinge, but can neither reduce them to concrete substances, nor transcendental concepts, neither to objects of the understanding, nor to presentations or representations, neither to objects of possible experience, nor to that which could not possibly be in any way whatsoever, like some kind of impossible object or concept. And if the division into the possible and the impossible is the highest concept, this is Kant, with which it is normal to begin a transcendental philosophy, well then, we will presumably have to go beyond the norm to relinquish the usual subterfuge die gewöhnliche Ausflucht. To give up the philosophy of the possible and the impossible, whether it dominates the present age and virtually every single philosophy that we have today, whether it seems to determine our words and deeds, thoughts and things or not. For the problematic, the metaphysical problematic, that which is truly problematic, the tough problem or problematic problem, this resists the translations and transpositions, the permutations and combinations, the destructions and deconstructions of the history of philosophy as the metaphysics of possibility, as much as the history of philosophy as the metaphysics of impossibility, even if that means getting along without determining whether the problem is necessarily or possibly something or nothing. Etwas oder nichts. That is, whether there is any problem whatsoever. This is Kant. Kant says this. If the problem then is neither a question of the possible nor the impossible, if it's merely a limit concept, a horizon of thought and word, so an empty object without concept, in other words, is the problem something about which we cannot speak, and so must, in Wittgenstein's words, remain silent? Or is there a third thing, das dritte? So, tertium datur, a way of thinking, that which is neither something nor nothing, and so suspends the philosophy of possibility and impossibility alike. Bon, voilà, that's the question. Indeed, the suspension of the problem is the suspension of the problem. In other words, it's precisely this suspending, the suspension of apodiction and assertion, something and nothing, the possible and the impossible, therefore the necessary as well, of course, that points the way to the problem, to a philosophy of the problem, a problematic philosophy, a metaphysics, therefore, of suspension, or a metaphysics which is also a metaphysics, therefore, of the problem, which would presumably be a problematic metaphysics. Husserl thinks this as epoche, as the suspension which characterizes the essence of the problem, which is probably why the experience of the problematic is so suspenseful. So, what does it mean to suspend the possibility and impossibility of the problem? The epoche is not just skeptical doubt, the Greek or Cartesian or some other form, not merely a question of necessarily abstaining or excluding, whitewashing or washing away, nor simply altering or changing from one possibility to another, nor just retreating to the assertion of impossibility, nor to both the possible and the impossible, much less assuming or presuming, supposing or presupposing, determining or judging, negating or destroying, destructuring or deconstructing. Rather, it is a way of holding, of keeping oneself back, of continuously holding back from judgment. Urteilsenthaltung. A way of holding, then, the epoche allows us to bear or carry the weight of what is held, borne or carried. Vertragen. And in order to hold ourselves in a way so as to bear it, the epoche suspends judgment, including, for example, the natural attitude. This is a whole you can add to this list. Consciousness, the sciences, prejudicial signification, self-contradictory interpretations, the transcendent, the unity of mind and body, man, everything that presents itself to me as factually existing actuality. That's Husserl. That which seems to be actually and really there or not there, but elsewhere, as well as the categories of judgment, that is necessity and contingency, existence and non-existence, possibility and impossibility. For in order to uncover the given, the absolutely givenness of essences, transcendental consciousness, phenomena, intentional objects, cogitatum qua cogitatum, the epoche transforms, translates or metamorphosizes by putting out of action or play, shuts off or closes off, contains or parenthesizes. But in this way, the epoche shows itself to be not only negative. For parenthesizing a judgment, holds onto it as a parenthesized judgment. And the suspended thesis becomes the thesis suspended. That's what's up. Thus, suspension does not simply produce some kind of positive residuum like pure subjectivity or transcendental ego, essence or eidos, whether necessary or possible. Rather, it allows us to think how what is reduced continues, or the continuation of suspense, of what is suspended and the suspending itself. Here, loss is gain. Putting out of play keeps in play. That which is in brackets remains bracketed. Being suspended is being suspended. And so too with the problem. Holding back from necessity and contingency, possibility and impossibility, something or nothing, suspending the usual subterfuge of the concepts by means of which we normally know and judge. This is the problem. And the way to think what is problematic about the problem, any problem whatsoever, at least insofar as it is problematic, for suspension is that which suspends knowledge and the necessary conditions of the possibility of knowledge, and the entire history of philosophy is a philosophy of the necessary or the possible, or its other, the contingent and the impossible, while continuing it qua problematic. But then the suspension of the problematic is just as much a problematic suspension. And not only knowing, but thinking, too, becomes problematic. Even an exercise in making problems that is suspended, which may very well be the definition of philosophy. And we may no longer be able to determine that there is necessarily a problem here or there, or none at all, or that there may possibly be one, or must necessarily be one, or cannot be one, or that it is necessarily impossible to say that there is one, or even possibly, for all this unsuspends or de-parenthesizes that which is problematic about the problem, which is the danger that we are trying here to avoid. So, what does it mean for the problem to be suspended, or for thinking? And how can we think that which such a problematization renders problematic? Or what does it mean to be a problem? In other words, what is the being of the problem? So, third question, second, the being of the problem. I don't just want to go to the question of the being of the problem for fun, but rather because it will show us and tell us something to think about the problem, not the problematic problem. The question of being. Indeed, the being of the problem, this question, the question of the being of the problem, which implies the question of being itself, is implied by the question of the problem, and therefore also unavoidable. And this problem is the Platonic problem, which leads Kant to the central problem, which has to be posed in the task of laying the foundation of the science of beings in general. That's from Heidegger, which leads Heidegger to pose the problem that underlying all beings are the principles of their being, which leads us to the problem of the being of the problem. So, what is the being of the problem? What is being, and is this a problem? If so, how so? In fact, we know since the Greeks, being has been understood neither as a particular being, nor as a genus from Aristotle, nor as a real predicate from Kant, for they do not suffice to name everything that is, as Heidegger reminds us, rather as presence. And coming into being, into existence or reality, appearing and showing, emerging and growing means coming into presence out of absence. And so going out into absence, just as standing and staying, resting and remaining, throughout change and movement, identity throughout difference means being continuously present, coming out of discontinuity. And whatever the name of the history, whatever name the history of philosophy, or the history of philosophy of metaphysics, as the study of being qua being, ton heon, gives to being, to everything that is, whatever determination comes to dominance, whether physis, number, matter, logos, hen, idea, ousia, essentia, existentia, God, ego, substance, reason, object, concept, spirit, will to power, etc., etc. Even if it is a particular being, it remains true to presence. I quote from Heidegger, "A definite unitary trait runs through them all. It points our understanding of to be toward a definite horizon by which the understanding is fulfilled. The boundary drawn around the sense of being stays within the sphere of presentness and presence. So, being is presence. Thank you, Heidegger, for finally bringing this to the fore. One of the paradigm shifts, one of the things that Heidegger has at least contributed. For I quote from Heidegger, from the dawn of Western European thinking until today, being means the same as presencing. But what is that? What is that? What is presence? It is not just a what, but a how. That is, how something is, how it presents itself, appears, shows itself, how it shines forth as what? The phenomena, the kind of being that it is. It's the way beings are. And thus, how problems, insofar as they too are as well. For being is itself not a being, although it is always the being of a being, and so cannot be traced back to another, more original being. Rather, being is the way any being whatsoever comes to presence. So, if we say something like, this celebration took place in the presence of many guests, we mean that it took place with many guests being present. It's Heidegger's example. For being means present. Letting be present, allowing to come to presence, revealing the presence of that which is present, unconcealing the event of being. And absence is merely its another, negative, privation, deficient way of being present. Indeed, I quote from Heidegger, the being present of something, absence is constitutive for this presence. Absence in the sense of deficiency, lack. This being there, in the sense of lack, is completely its own and positive. If I say of someone, I miss him very much, he is not there, I precisely do not mean to say that he is not there, but express a quite particular way that he is there for me. In other words, absence is a modality of presence, a way of presenting as non-presenting. Present deprived of presence, or present by being absent. For being present and being absent are how being is. So, for example, a natural thing, just as much as a cultural one, it's arbitrary whether I take one or the other as my example, is present or absent in nature. And nature as a whole is this coming to presence and going out into absence. It's how trees and forests, plants and animals and humans come to life, produce and reproduce, appear and unfold themselves in words and deeds as thoughts and things, here and now, repeatedly, continuously, and then go there, out of presence into absence or death, once and for all, or again and again. For the being of nature and natural things is the presencing and absencing of what is, thus how natural beings are present and absent, whether as a stone or an animal, earth or world, once or forever, us or a god, mortal or immortal, real or ideal, in motion or at rest, potential or actual, necessary or contingent, possible or impossible, etc., are in accordance with different ways of presencing and absencing. But what does it mean to think being qua presence? Or rather, presence and absence. In fact, what does it mean to think being in relation to time? The second, if I may, a great contribution that Heidegger has made to the history of philosophy after presence, the relation between being and time. It means thinking being in relation to time. So if we're thinking presence, being as presence, we are thinking being in relation to time. But being present or absent means being in time. Or more precisely, insofar as this in, or inness, is misleading, as Heidegger points out, it means being temporally. And what is this time to which being is related? If time is a way of being, it's neither what we see on watches, nor is it a measure of motion, as Aristotle might say, neither the order of things nor their schema, as Kant might say. Rather, time is a how. That is, how something comes to presence. How it is. Which is why ontology is essentially ontochronology. I'm using chronology simply to indicate the science of time. And the history of the concept of time, as Heidegger says, is the history of the question of the being of beings. In other words, time is the character of beings, not simply zeitlich, but temporal. So being must be thought in relation to temporality. And the meaning of being can only be illuminated in relation to time, which is why time is the horizon for any understanding of being whatsoever, as Heidegger says at the beginning of being in time. But if being qua presence is temporal, well then, what does that mean? Language, I think, gives us a clue. For presence, present time is a tense. That's why problems, and in fact any word or deed, thought or thing, appears as tensed. We say that we have a problem in present tense, or that he had a problem in past tense, or that she will have a problem in future tense. Although here by having we mean being. The problem is present. It belongs to us, so we have it with another. Or if we claim a problem comes from something or has ramifications for someone, or if they have succumbed to their problem, or if there is a problem or no problem, then we mean it comes to presence and presents itself whether it requires a response or not. Or if we are told that we are no longer a problem child, we know the problem, which was present itself in our behavior, is now absent. That is, present as having been overcome. For tense is a determination of verbs, which is why they are called Zeitwörter, time words. And if conjugation discloses action, how the deed is done, whether eating or drinking, sensing or imagining, knowing and understanding, speaking or thinking, doing or making, having or being as well. It's because all verbs take time, or more precisely, because language is not just in time, zeitlich, but is temporal. And if presence is understood as the way something is, something like a problem is, it is how it is now or then, or how it is in the present, factically thrown as being there, Heidegger's example. Or was in the past, and is so present, qua having been, whether in memory or retention, or some other way, or will be in the future, and so present qua to be, whether in protension or anticipation or some other way. But the ecstasies of time implying one another belong together are what let problems be what and how they are, were, and will be, just as being is what lets time come into presence and go out into absence. So, no time without being, no being without time. Which is why the presence and absence of being has the time of the present or non-present. Present or non-present. And a problem is one, or becomes a problem only insofar as it is present or comes to presence, it presents itself in one way or another. A problem, then, is an actual problem or a possible one, a problem that is problematic for me or you, us or them, here or now. There or then, a problem that is one of words or deeds, thoughts or things, one that is real or imaginary, a problem that is maybe conceptual or might even be metaphysical, that presents itself as necessarily or possibly, actually or potentially solvable or insoluble. All these ways of being a problem, of being problematic, are ways in which problems are present now or not now, come to presence and absence, present themselves as absent, or present themselves as non-problems, or no longer problematic, solved or resolved problems that present themselves as being old and tired, that have been superseded or overcome, and so are absent. And yet, if the being of a problem is its presence, that is how it comes to presence and goes out into absence, if it is in the present, that is, if the being of the problem has its tense, its time, then it also has its aspect. For time alone cannot account for the way of being of a problem. Nor for how everything is. Rather, insofar as being is a verb, to be, like all verbs, it has tense, past, present, future, now, not now, present, non-present, and aspect. Simple, continuous, completed, complete, incomplete. Doesn't matter how you pause it. Anybody who's learned an ancient language or Russian knows that there's a difference between time and aspect, and every verb has it, both, not just one, both. Which is neither, let's not make this mistake, its mood, indicative, subjunctive, optative, nor its voice, active, middle, passive, and certainly nothing like its perspective or view, side, or face. For aspect is the other of time, the other way in which anything whatsoever is at each and every time and at any time whatsoever. It's the other how of deeds done. So at one and the same time, I can think discontinuously, completely, and be thinking continuously, incompletely, about a problem. I can think and be thinking, both present tense, present time, different aspects. Even one like perfect justice, in present time or with the temporality of what is present. I might have thought and have been thinking about it. Past time, different aspects. Or I shall think and shall have thought it. Future time, future tense, different aspects. And the difference between these ways of being a problem, of being problematic, whether conceptually or metaphysically, is an aspectual difference. But then, every temporal problem is an aspectual one as well. Or any time a problem comes to presence, presents itself or absences itself, it does so with aspect, for being and being a problem or being problematic has a double character, temporal, aspectual, at least insofar as aspect is the other of time. But not just. But what about being? Being qua presence. Does it not, like time, have an other as well? I quote from Aristotle. Now, if being and unity are the same, and are of one nature in the sense that they are implied by one another as principle and cause, but not in the sense that they have the same definition, for one man and man are the same thing, and so are being man, and the doubling of the words in one man and being one man does not express anything different. It's clear that the two things are not separated either in coming to be or in ceasing to be, so that it is obvious that the addition in these cases means the same thing, and unity is nothing apart from being. And this being so, there must be exactly as many species of being as of unity. Any interpretation of Aristotle, therefore, as ontology is one-sided. Forgets about the fact that being implies unity. And science and metaphysics has to be ontopenology, if you will. So, the other of time is aspect, and the other of being is unity. Then, if a problem is to be one, a problem, if it comes to presence now and continuously, it does so as an indivisible or divisible one, separate or inseparable from others. These are Aristotle's determinations of unity. And this is why the history of philosophy as metaphysics is able to determine being under a unitary trait. For if physis, number, matter, logos, hen, ide, ousia, essentia, extensia, God, ego, subject, substance, reason, object, concept, spirit, will, power, presence, etc., any of these are to be the meaning of being. It's because each is one. Then, unity is the other how of things, not a unit. But the way in which something is what presents itself, appears, comes to presence as indivisible, and goes out into absence, is what it is. And so, how each thing can be unified, united, both in itself and with others. I'll leave the other out. So, if we say something like, the celebration took place in the presence of many guests, I take as an example, we mean the many guests attended one celebration. For unity means indivisibility, letting each guest be one, separated together, thanks to the oneness of the celebration, their presence at the event that was celebrated. In this way, unity characterizes what is. Anything that is, insofar as it is, whether a plant or animal, stone or human or God, a celebratory event or a non-event, a real Ereignis, or even a so-called Enteignis, appropriation or expropriation, in fact, any word or deed, thought or thing whatsoever. If it is one. Or more precisely, unity is how everything that is. How things, and things like problems, which is simply an example of something that is one, are real or ideal, emotion or rest, potential or actual, necessary or unnecessary, possible or impossible, how they come to presence or go out into absence for. These are not just ways of being, they are ways of being one temporally and aspectually. Now we have the fourfold of being, unity, time, and aspect. So, first question, third, the how of the problem. Being, unity, time, and aspect. These would seem essential for any understanding of the problem, even for thinking what is problematic about the problem. But what are they? Or at least, if we suspend discussion of unity and time and aspect, and limit ourselves, because I see I'm running out of time, to being. What is being? Such that it could be the being of a problem. Or, if being is to be the how of any problem whatsoever, then, is it merely presence and or absence? And tertium non datur? There is no third kindlitus? Or is there? Aristotle reminds us, being and unity are implied by one another. What does that mean? To imply. To be an implication. To be implied by everything that is, and so by problems. Let's take a clue from language. For Benjamin, 20 years before Heidegger, let's not forget, 20 years before Heidegger says, language alone speaks. In Greek, Heraclitus says, ethos anthropodaimon. McKieran translates, I'll just give the normal English translations. A person's character is his divinity. Kant, man's character is his fate. Heidegger, in typical Heideggerian fashion, translates, the familiar abode for humans is the opening for the presencing of the unfamiliar God. Don't ask me to defend that. But, here we go. The word is not in the original Greek. Ethos, anthropodaimon. Why not? Being's not present. Which is not to say that it's absent. It's implied. And an implication is precisely that which fails to present itself as an appearance, which is not to say that it is a disappearance. But what is implied can be neither necessarily nor even possibly determined as appearing, nor asserted to be that which cannot appear. It is that which cannot even be judged to be something or nothing, here or there, now or then, never or always. In this sense, implication is not the opposite or negation of explication, nor can it simply be translated into the language of the explicit, made explicit or explained, at least not without losing precisely that which is being implied, which would be the usual subterfuge. On the contrary, it's the suspension of the possibility and impossibility, the necessity and contingency of explication, and so presumably that which makes impression and expression, the coming to presence of explanation, and the historical overcoming of explanation by explanation, so suspenseful. This is why Heraclitus simply says, human, character, divine. For to be does not mean to be present, but to be implied, and being is implied. Bon voilà. Or in English, another example from Keats. He ends the Ode on a Grecian Urn, probably the most famous poem in the English language. I quote, "When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe, than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth. Truth, beauty. That is all you need to know. All ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. In other words, is not present. Why? Because being is implied, which doesn't mean it's absent. Being's way of being is what the poem is about. The secret of the poem, if not of poetry itself, a secret kept hidden in full view, like the purloined letter in Poe. Suspended right before our eyes. We merely have to read the history of philosophy, read the history of poetry, read the history of literature, so that being, qua implication, is the still unravished bride of quietness, which haunts the poem. It is that which the poem's lover cannot kiss, the meaning which, failing to present itself, cannot be grasped. Thus, like the poem's bold lover, who cannot kiss the beloved, because frozen in the poem, so in marble, of course, or on the urn. So too, that being which is implied cannot come to presence and present itself, be asserted or apodicted, revealed or concealed, demonstrated or determined, nor remain absent in absence. It's merely an implication. Or in the Russian present tense, the first line of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground reads, Ya человек больной, ya zlой человек. But Peter and Volonsky translate, I am a sick man. I am a wicked man. The translation is not wrong here. This is not what I'm saying. It's right. But the text says, I man sick. Or, as Russian word order, like Greek, is flexible, I sick man, I wicked man. There is no is. Being is not there, it is not present, it does not come to presence. Although nor is it absent, it's not necessary to write being between subject and predicate, nor is it actually even possible, as every Russian knows, without doing a certain kind of injustice, if not violence, to language, as well as to implication, to being, to the truth of being, so to thinking and speaking, doing and imagining and feeling, to everything that is. As every Russian child knows, being is implied. Language then tells us that being is implied. It tells us what being is. An implication. What is that? And more precisely, what does it mean to think how being is implied? For how can implication be thought as being, and so the being of a problem, or what a problem is? In fact, if an implication is neither present nor absent, but just implied, it's because it's a problem. Then implied, not only in speaking, but just as much in doing and thinking and being anything and everything that is, being is problematic. For implication is a way of being that suspends the necessity and contingency, the possibility and impossibility of being there, of coming to presence, indeed of presence itself. So that which is problematic about the problem is not an implied problem, not just an implied problem, but that being and the being of the problem is only implied. Then being's way of being implied by things, like problems, is in suspense. Neither something nor nothing, neither being nor non-being, but tertium datur, a third thing, to be held, kept, carried, borne. For being is a problem, perhaps the most problematic of problems, or that which is problematic about any problem whatsoever, at least in ontology, whether in the arts or sciences, mathematical or material, real or fake, true or false, mine or yours or ours, and if implication can possibly be asserted to be real, actual, true, and then may be determined to be necessary, even apodictically, it's because it is first problematic. I'm here following Kant's way of developing the problematic. Or shall we say the esoteric and apodictic out of the originally problematic. Not just being. For the problem is a problem as well, at least if it is and is one temporally and spectrally problematic. But if we hope to take it up as a problem, keep it in suspension, like the problem of perfect justice, perhaps of any justice whatsoever, and so attempt to think, thereby problematize the problem, that which does not come to presence, which is not to say that it remains in absence, then it seems we must also admit that none of this is necessary, nor actually even possible, for we do not know what a problem is, or even that it is, that there is a problem, nor can we say that it is something or nothing at all. Rather, insofar as the problem is thinking the problematic, what the problem is or how it is implied, the problem would be to think the suspension of the problem, if we can bear what is to be thought the problem, and if it is to be problematic, and whatever the implications, even if that makes more problems, and so to think how the problem suspends thinking, especially if, as Parmenides reminds us, it is not just a matter of speaking and thinking that which is being as implied, but toga auto no ein estin te kaine, that is, speaking and thinking, that thinking and being are the same, namely problematic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your. But we can also in Basque language question. Yes? Okay. Basque, German, English.
As you like.
Thank you for your paper, especially for English. So, I'm sorry for my very really broken German. So, what's wrong with the another form of implication? I mean, Nachdenklichkeit in works of Freud, where he speaks about present which not really never been presented, or like Derrida says about Derrida's text which never have been written, and this also dialectic presence and absence, and there are already tradition of such tracing notion of unconsciousness, and so also there are. Do you address Heideggerian Wesen, which is also kind of form of being, which is not explicitly is, but kind of implied? And about very short question, how really we should practice the implication of the problem, so not to answer the problem, which every scientific research does, or you really mean that there are really epistemological and ontological gap principle between sciences and philosophy, and so kind of practice of implication.
Okay. As for your first question, the reason why I went to Kant was not just the scholarly reason to trace Heidegger back to Kant. But,
and about psychoanalytic traditions.
Yeah, I'm getting to that. I'm not saying that implication has not been thought in the history of philosophy, as you say, not Nachdenklichkeit and many other Derrida, etc., Levinas certainly have thought it. However, it seems to me that they always, at least as far as I know, think of implication in terms of possibility or impossibility. That is, even if they don't reduce implication to presence and absence, which they tend to do to begin with, right? The God that presence is, or the presence of a dead loved one. Right? They're here, present with me, even though they're dead. They're present in my life. They're presence. We even call a ghost a presence in my life. So, we tend, in the history of philosophy and literature and psychoanalysis, to think of implication in terms of presence and absence, which I think is a mistake, first of all. Second of all, when we do that and we want to explain what it is, we resort to the usual subterfuge of possibility and impossibility. Derrida does this, Levinas does this. I would have to, obviously, we'd have to go through those texts, but I believe I could demonstrate this in Derrida and Levinas and Freud as well, but I'll keep that aside. Certainly, as far as I've read, Levinas and Derrida certainly always employ the language of possibility and impossibility. Derrida especially is philosopher of impossibility. And so, the reason why I went to Kant is because he sees, I think, that the problematic is originally what cannot be understood within the categories of possibility and impossibility. This, I mean, to find this in Kant was truly shocking to me. So I was very, very interested and excited to find that when it comes to talk about things like problems, not in the categorical sense, not in the sense of what can be understood, but what cannot be known, but must be thought. So there's a difference between knowledge and thinking in Kant. Heidegger brings this out. We must think the problematic, but we cannot use the categories, especially the categories of the possible and the impossible, to think the problematic of implication. With that said, in response to your second question, in terms of practice, I think the reason why I went to Husserl is because I think he gives us an absolutely brilliant way of dealing with suspension, which it seems to me is, if you will, employing Husserlian language, the eidos of the essence of the problem, qua problematic. Namely, that we suspend the possible and the impossible, these categories of knowing. And in this suspension, we bear or carry, without rushing into judgment, we maintain or hold, continue the problematic, qua problematic, implication, qua implication, without reducing it to what's explicit. I mean, that doesn't obviously deal with specific psychoanalytic practices or any other kind of practice, but one would have to work out with that.
Yes, okay.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. What do you think about English translation of Nachtraglichkeit as deferred action? Is the symptomatic because there is a dialectic of possibility and impossibility appearance?
Well, I mean, we would have to look at the text clearly to understand the context within which Freud is using Nachtraglichkeit and see how he understands what it is. But if
deferred action is something which will be explicitly, yes, and which was...
It depends on whether he understands this explication of it as a possibility or an impossibility, or whether he holds on to it as problematic.
Yes, I think psychoanalytic practice is kind of phenomenological practice of sense.
Yeah, in many ways, if the problem remains what Heidegger would call offen, if it remains open, well, then we're moving towards at least some reflection on the problem that we want to see.
Okay.
Your question? Yes.
Actually, I almost entirely agree with your thesis concerning the Kantian problematic of doctrine. We have one classical monography about the topic, so it should be more deep, I think. But it seems to me it is a bit your strategy was a bit peculiar in the sense of that Kant and Epoche in Husserlian sense, but without Hegelian dialectic. It seems to me a bit peculiar. If we should read so seriously the Hegelian claim according to which Kant is good because he was the, how to say, he discovered the dialectical, in the pluralism, but we have to discover not only in the pluralism, but yes, in the concept. It's the Hegelian dream, I think, and if so, maybe the relation to Hegel is, of course, I see already the difference between Hegel and Heidegger, of course, but if it may be more helpful if you explain some Hegel and Heidegger, or such as what is the scheme of Heidegger? Hegel.
Obviously in a short text like this, it's impossible to deal with everybody in history and philosophy. Hegel, I didn't find as useful for me in this context. First of all, it depends on how you read Hegel. I don't see in Hegel a thinking of das Drittes that does not fall into the possible and the impossible, or into presence and absence. I don't see this kind of implication that is weder noch in Hegel. Certainly there's an ambiguity, right? Aufheben, wie aufgeben, zweideutig. I'm quoting from that, roughly from Hegel, right? Because obviously aufheben means both to, preserve and destroy, get rid of and destroy. So he is a thinker of the Zweideutigkeit in each concept, but I don't see in Hegel this thinking of the third. So that's why I didn't go to Hegel. I mean, obviously I'm trying to think something, that where I take what I can use from different thinkers rather than critique someone like Hegel. So, I mean, you could develop. I'm not against it. You could develop a history of a philosophy of history in Hegel, for example. Then took history as implicative, but I think you need some evidence for that. I don't know where you'd find that.
Ich würde Ihnen eine Frage stellen, die nicht unmittelbar, aber nur mittelbar mit Ihrem Vortrag etwas zu tun hat. Was denken Sie von der griechischen Etymologie des Wortes Problema als Hindernis?
We'd have to look at the etymology of problema. As far as I remember it, it comes from probalo. And balo, right, is to throw. So to throw out there. Over and against me. What is thrown before me. And therefore what comes to me, what confronts me, if you will. So if you want to understand, I mean, that doesn't exclude thinking of the problem as hinderness, since this is not an immediate but a mediated question. If it's a question of what is thrown out over and against me, okay, which is obviously not a Gegenstand, which steht nicht gegen mir gegenüber, but which confronts me, well then what confronts me is this question, if you will, of implication of what is neither present nor absent, and is thrown out in front of me, but is not there, is not present. Now, if it's a hinderness, that's where I would go to someone like Husserl and say, well, suspending is not only negative, but also positive. So too with a hinderness. Not only negative, but positive. Good.
But not in It's
I
not
mean,
an idea of good.
No, not the idea. No, I didn't. Sorry, I didn't mean that. Not in the Greek sense of no. I mean, if you, I don't know. I mean, we'd have to look at the text of Aristotle. If you're referring specifically to the aporia in Aristotle, these problems that he lists, some of which he overcomes, and they're to be overcome. Well, I would say, precisely what the Greek tells us is that there are problems which can be overcome, but can also be maintained. And it's in this holding on to the problem, or the hinderness, that we learn something.
An Italian scholar, Gaetano Cuvazzi, some years ago has written a very interesting book. The title was Heidegger and the Grammar of Being, where he says that the basis of this grammar of being, a grammar which can name being, Heidegger being, the basis is not the name, not the noun, not the verb, but the conjunction das Bienenwort. That is the only way to name Heidegger's being, so the implication, the product, and so on. What, do you agree, or don't you agree? Grammar based, not based on nouns, not based on verbs, but on conjunction.
The being should be based on conjunctions. I haven't read that book. Sorry. So, who's it by?
Gaetano Cuvazzi. It's in Italian, I think, but no, it is translated maybe. I have to control. Heidegger and the Grammar of Being. Heidegger, Grammatica dell'essere in Italian. I control them.
Okay. Yeah.
I control it.
Von Heidegger selbst haben wir die
He does.
Einführung in
Yes, exactly. Heidegger does his own grammar of being. In some ways, I've done a grammar of being as well, or attempted to. It's fruitful for me because, I don't know. I was astounded not only to come to Russian and start to learn Russian and see that being is implied in Russian, but when you learn Greek, to learn that being is implied in Greek as well. And then to see Aristotle say that being and unity implying one another, akoluthein is the Greek that he uses here, they follow from one another. There's a whole thinking implication here. It seems that the grammar of being is one in which being can be implied, and that teaches us a lot about being. That maybe in the history of philosophy we have forgotten.
It's grammar of absence.
So, brief question. What do you think? Thank you very much for your presentation. And the question is, what do you think about possible, so to say, extra-linguistic ways or extra-linguistic forms of cultivation of being? Because I think so. The understanding of being or usage of copular verb is an index of giveness of being for human Dasein in Heidegger, but it cannot be used to such usage. So Smith doesn't have say the hammer is hard, but he use or cannot use the hammer and so on. Is it possible in philosophy? Is it possible to cultivate being extra language in some extra languages practices in philosophy?
For example, in informal logic, for example. Predicate logic,
yes. But is it a kind of practice formal logic?
One could say, for example, that formal logic, in a way that wouldn't make predicate logic, for example, that would be a reductive or abstracted or translation from implied being into another language, and therefore accompanied with an attendant kind of violence that happens in all translation. You can do it, sure. Should you do it? Would you thereby cover over, forget being as implication? Yes, certainly. No, even Kant, and I agree. No one is against thinking of being in the perfectly normal way, as a copula, as a genus, as a real predicate, however you want to think about it. There's no problem. The only thing is that there's a cost. And so I'm trying to take account of this cost, the cost of overlooking being as implication.
I have a general question. Why have you decided to speak about the problem, but not about the question? For example, we can put the question. What does it mean to put the question? And we remember the Aristotle's fourth book of metaphysics, where he speaks about the correct question. What does it mean to put the correct question? So why you have decided to speak about not the question but the problem? And what does it mean to have the problem, for example, or to have the question?
One of the reasons is because in a conference like this, I felt that it was important for me to speak about Kant and Heidegger. And for Heidegger, the question is always the question meaning being. Heidegger takes this term, the question, and that becomes, therefore, his way of thinking being. As I would argue, presence and absence. And therefore, if I wanted to think about what Heidegger's thinking about, but not use Heidegger's terminology of the question, I had to use a different term. So that's why I use the term problem, to indicate a way of thinking about being that doesn't think of it in terms of the question of presence and absence, or the question of the meaning of being, in Heidegger's terms. Because I don't think that Heidegger thinks the problem of being as implied. So it's actually merely it's a terminological choice to fulfill my Abgrenzungsbedürfnis over and against Heidegger. On the matter of the question.
The last question. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your interesting report. My question is, how are the things which were well known and which are still well known, how they became to be problematic, to be a problem?
We became.
How the things became to be a problem? Unexpected.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question. I mean, how does philosophy happen, right? How does thinking come about? Why are we thinking rather than not thinking? Hegel, for example, would say history. Right? In this point in history, we happen to be at a place where the problem and the problem of implication happens, comes to the fore in some way as a problem. Things become problematic when we start to think. That's what Heidegger would say. When we start to think, things become a question. I would say they become problematic when we start to think. Why do we start to think? Possible. For me, it's really, Aristotle. Okay, sue me. I'm an Aristotelian. Okay, fine. It's astounding that we see in Aristotle. I mean, in Plato and Aristotle, and the Greeks in general. I mean, when I am confronted by the problem, by implication. Now, why I got confronted by it, that's a whole other thing. Maybe that is history. But when I am confronted with it, I feel like I need to respond. And I can respond with the usual subterfuge. The history of philosophy gives me plenty of categorical options, the possible and the impossible, which is extremely popular nowadays, the impossible, or necessary and contingent, which remains the discourse of science and the natural and human sciences. Or I can respond in a different way.
Okay. Thank you very much for your bite tracts of philosophy. And